On May 26, 1908, at 4 a.m., a drilling crew in southwestern Persia heard a sound no European had heard there before. Oil erupted from the ground at 360 meters, deeper than the Eiffel Tower is tall, and rose 15 meters, drenching the men on the platform. That well, at Masjid Suleiman, was the first commercial oil discovery in the Middle East. The crew sent a coded telegram to London. William Knox Darcy, who had funded 7 years of dry wells, had his answer. Our Hormuz episode named it. This one explains what it cost. Within 5 years, Winston Churchill had ordered the Royal Navy to convert from coal to oil propulsion. Within 6 years, the British government had purchased a controlling stake in the company that owned the concession. Within 8 years, 2 diplomats drew a line across a map of the Middle East. That line was not drawn by ambition alone. It was drawn by fuel gauges. The modern Middle East, its borders, its conflicts, its political geography, traces back not to empires and their ambitions, but to a geological accident in a mountain range most of the world had never heard of. Before 1908, the Persian Gulf was an administrative backwater. Britain cared about it only as a corridor, the last stretch of open water between Suez and Bombay. To understand what the discovery changed, you have to understand what that corridor actually was. In 1900, the Gulf was a British strategic concern for exactly one reason: the route to India. The Trucial states, the sheikdoms that would become the United Arab Emirates, were under British protection agreements signed beginning in 1820. Kuwait had been under a British protectorate since 1899. Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman were all within Britain's informal sphere. The purpose of all these arrangements was the same. They were route security. Britain needed to ensure that no other power, Ottoman, Russian, or German, could establish a naval base that might threaten the passage of ships between Suez and Bombay. The Gulf itself produced pearls, dates, and dried fish. The pearl trade out of Bahrain and the Trucial coast supplied the jewelry markets of Europe. It was a modest economy, valuable locally, irrelevant strategically. Britain's interest in the Gulf was entirely about what lay beyond it. The destination was India. The Gulf was the corridor. That corridor was about to become the destination. The story of how Britain got to Masjid Suleiman begins 11 years earlier with a man named William Knox Darcy. Darcy was an English entrepreneur who had made a fortune in Australian gold mining. In 1901, he negotiated a 60-year concession from the Persian government, the right to explore for oil across 480,000 square miles of Persian territory, in exchange for £20,000 in cash, £20,000 in shares, and 16% of future profits. By 1905, Darcy had spent most of his own fortune on dry wells and was nearly bankrupt. The Burma Oil Company, a Scottish firm with Indian operations, stepped in with financing to keep the drilling going. 3 more years. More dry wells. The crew moved the operation south into the Zagros foothills at Masjid Suleiman. Then, on May 26, 1908, the coded telegram. C. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company was incorporated the following year, 1909, to develop the field. The Abadan Refinery, soon the world's largest, came online in 1913. The question was, who owned it? And who controlled the territory it sat on? In 1912, Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, faced a problem. The Royal Navy ran on British coal. German naval expansion was accelerating. More efficient ships were needed. Oil-powered vessels could go further and faster than coal-powered ones and be refueled at sea. Coal could not. Churchill proposed converting the entire fleet. The problem was immediately obvious. Britain had coal. Britain did not have oil, not in the quantities the modern navy required. The nearest large supply was in Persia, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company's fields at Masjid Suleiman, flowing through the Abadan Refinery, loading into tankers in the Gulf. In 1914, 2 months before the First World War began, the British government purchased a 51% controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company for £2.2 million, roughly £250 million in today's money. The justification was simple. Britain needed guaranteed access to oil, and the only way to guarantee it was to own the company that produced it. This single decision converted the oil fields of southwestern Persia from a commercial asset into a matter of British national survival. A coal-powered navy could source its fuel from British mines. An oil-powered navy, the navy Churchill had just created, now depended on Persian oil fields connected to a refinery at Abadan that sat on a contested border, in a country with a weak government surrounded by competing imperial powers. The Gulf was no longer a route, it was a lifeline. The purchase of APOC was not the end of Britain's problem, it was the beginning of a much larger one. Owning the company meant owning the fields, but the fields produced oil in a country, Persia, whose government was weak, whose territory was contested, and whose border with Ottoman Mesopotamia ran directly through the Shatt al-Arab waterway, 2 miles from the Abadan refinery. To protect the oil, Britain needed to control the territory surrounding it. That meant Mesopotamia, the Basra Vilayet, the islands of the Upper Gulf, the approach routes through what are now Kuwait and southern Iraq. This is where geography becomes politics. The British oil infrastructure created a security perimeter. That perimeter required political control. Political control required either direct administration or compliant governments in the surrounding territories. Britain had been building this informal empire since 1820. The oil discovery did not change the method, it changed the stakes. What had been a matter of route security was now a matter of industrial survival. The infrastructure that kept the Royal Navy moving had to be defended at any cost. And that security perimeter, once drawn, would never be surrendered without a fight. In 1953, that control was taken back, not by Iran. The full story of what happened in those 53 days and why it produced the Islamic Revolution of 1979 is its own episode. What matters for this map is the outcome. The Shah returned. Savak was built. And 26 years later, the only institution the secret police could not destroy, the mosque network, became the only one left to lead a revolution. The 1953 coup did not prevent radicalism. It designed its only possible architecture. The deeper issue was structural. Britain had built an oil infrastructure, fields, pipeline, refinery, tanker routes that sat across the borders of a collapsing empire. The Ottoman Empire had disintegrated after the First World War. The borders it left behind were not designed for the age of oil. They were the residue of an administrative system built for tax collection, not for pipeline protection. Oil at this scale requires certainty, and certainty requires political control and borders that match the infrastructure. Britain had chosen the first option, and that meant the map of the Middle East, the one inherited from the Ottomans, the one that had governed this region for 4 centuries, could not survive contact with what sat beneath it. Someone had to draw a new one. That story belongs to the next episode. What matters here is why it was necessary. Not ambition, not ideology, not religion, though all of those played a role. The immediate cause was a pipeline, and the pipeline began at Masjid Suleiman. The British oil geography chapter in the Middle East ran from 1908 to 1956. The 1953 coup was the attempt to hold it. The 1956 Suez crisis was the moment Britain discovered it could not. Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in July 1956. The canal was the artery connecting the oil fields of the Gulf to the refineries and markets of Europe. Britain and France intervened militarily. The United States refused to support the operation and threatened financial penalties. Britain withdrew. The lesson was specific. Britain's capacity to use military force to protect its oil infrastructure had a ceiling, and it was the ceiling imposed by Washington. The informal empire that had secured the Gulf since 1820 was no longer sustainable on British terms. By the time Britain formally withdrew from east of Suez in 1971, every oil asset it had held or protected in the Middle East had been nationalized, shared under new terms, or transferred to governments with their own interests. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company had become BP. The wells at Masjid Suleiman still operated, but they operated under terms that bore no resemblance to the concession William Knox Darcy had negotiated in 1901. In 1970, BP, the company that had started in the mountains of southwestern Persia, discovered the Forties oil field in the North Sea. It was the largest oil field in British territorial waters. Within 5 years, North Sea production was replacing Middle Eastern supply. Britain became an oil exporter for the first time since the 1930s. The geographic logic repeated. When access to one supply was lost, through nationalization, revolution, or military withdrawal, the country built around oil found it elsewhere. The Persian Gulf answered the question of 1912. The North Sea answered 1956. The rule held, the location changed. But before accepting that as a resolution, consider what the North Sea actually was. The fields were not owned by the British state. They were owned by BP, Shell, Exxon, and Total, international corporations whose obligations ran to their shareholders, not to Whitehall. Britain received tax revenues. It did not receive control. And North Sea oil was structurally more expensive to extract than Middle Eastern oil, which meant the British market remained exposed to global price shocks regardless of what came out of the seabed north of Aberdeen. The independence was an accounting entry. Strategically, the dependency had simply moved from one form to another. Britain stopped needing Persian oil. It started needing global oil markets to price its own production at a level that made the extraction worthwhile. The logic of 1908 had not ended. It had evolved. By 1916, the oil was flowing, and the stakes had become astronomical. But the old maps of the Middle East were a tangle of tribal boundaries and fading empires. They no longer matched what sat beneath the ground. Two men were about to sit down in a dimly lit office in London and redraw the world, ignoring everything but the pipelines. The geography of oil access has not changed. Only the map has.